Well, hi, everybody. It's David Leese here, your proud host of Leaders on the Frontier on this April 3rd, 2025. And by golly, is there an awful lot going on today? So, a warm welcome to our audience from coast to coast to coast. In fact, I think of the third coast that sometimes we don't think of in Canada. My friend Robert Falcon Ouellette, a former Liberal MP from Winnipeg, underlined that eloquently the other week when he was on the show. And he said, yes, let's remember all three coasts. And so, good afternoon, everyone, including Prairie. And we've got such a tremendous response as we value your questions, your comments, and observations as Canadians. And this is obviously a significant time during this electoral period. So, we're going to talk about the issues that matter to Canadians, to you, as we reflect on the policy issues, the choices that we face. We pride ourselves in being, quote, nonpartisan. We are partisan, though, to principles. And that relates to, well, principles like transparency and accountability. So, more than ever, we would say we would need discussion on the issues, not the personalities per se, but focused on what are the wise choices as we choose to govern. And it's often been said to govern is to choose. Well, what are the choices that we face? So, on that note, we make a warm welcome to all of you and look forward to our discussion today. And I did want to lead off with a few headlines as the audience comes on board and then we get to our special guests. We're really excited about that today. So, some news headlines are, I believe, today is the day that leaders of the Freedom Convoy are receiving their verdicts. I don't believe they're sentencing, pardon me, but I believe that is for Chris Barber and Tamara Leach. There, you can see Tamara and Chris there, and I believe there's been a conviction of mischief. So I don't know exactly what that means in terms of sentencing. I think that will follow, but we'll see what comes out of that. It's also interesting that in Winnipeg we have a federal Liberal MP, Ben Carr. He's the son of the late Jim Carr, who I knew well. Has called for a bubble zone legislation to ban protests outside, quote, religiously associated facilities, as there have been recent demonstrations outside what's called the Asper Community Center. It's a really centered on the Jewish community, although it's open for the public. So that's a very interesting proposal. Do bubble zones work, and how do you balance that off with the right for freedom of speech and demonstration, or is it inappropriate to undertake those kinds of demonstrations? So it's obviously a larger discussion, but it's interesting that Ben Carr has weighed in on that issue. In other headlines, we know that Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has promised to fast track approvals for so-called utility corridors across Canada. The idea is that energy corridors could accommodate not only energy, but also electricity and really the movement of all kinds of products across Canada. And I believe these corridors would likely be something like 4 kilometers wide, and they would speed up the ability to get Canada moving economically. I believe that's one idea. In fact, one of them is proposed across Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba to Port Nelson, Manitoba on Hudson's Bay. In other news, I know NDP leader Jagmeet Singh has announced his commitment to ensure private health care options are not permittable. And basically, I think I interpret that as a commitment to enforce the Canada Healthcare Act. We have obviously an awful lot going on today, and certainly one of those news has to do with the world of tariffs, so-called Liberation Day in the United States. And I just wanted to highlight of course, the headline there is that we'll get to this in our conversation. Is now it's our turn to prosper, and in so doing, use trillions of dollars to reduce our taxes and pay down our national debt. President Donald Trump declared in the United States. So that's obviously very appropriate, and actually it's we'll discuss that and its implications on Canada and the rest of the world and what is really going on and how do we understand that state of affairs. In other news, it's interesting. I noticed that published today on April the 3rd was a report by Stats Canada saying that our trade deficit this month in February is $1.5 billion dollars as exports fell. And that's compared to January, where we had a surplus in January of 3.1 billion. And meanwhile, we know that in February uh, yeah. Putting that aside, that's kind of the interesting headline there from Stats Canada. So there's an awful lot going on in this nation and around the world. And so with me here today, I am delighted to introduce two panelists today. And that is, of course, Catherine Swift, who is the president of the Coalition of Businesses and Manufacturers. A warm welcome to you, Catherine.
Thanks, David.
And of course, Dr. Marco Navarro-Genie, who's our vice president of research and policy at Frontier. And a warm welcome to you, Marco.
Thank you, David. Good to be here.
You know, we've got lots to talk about today, so I wanted to lead off with a clip by with President Donald Trump announcing so-called Liberation Day at the White House Rose Garden yesterday.
My fellow Americans, this is Liberation Day, waiting for a long time. April 2nd, 2025 will forever be remembered as the day American industry was reborn, the day America's destiny was reclaimed, and the day that we began to make America wealthy again. We're going to make it wealthy.
So there you have it, President Trump. I mean, this is a complicated issue, but he's weighing in on what appears to be kind of a wholesale set of tariffs. We even have a chart here from the White House that we could note here, but there's a lot of information here where there's an analysis they have on pursuing the principle of reciprocity, the whole notion that if you're a country, if you do 0% tariffs, we'll do 0, and if you do 50, we'll do 50, we'll match you. And it's interesting that Canada and Mexico are not on that list, so we're trying to figure out what's up and what's down here for our country, the impacts, and that's going to unfold a bit. So I don't want to mislead anybody, but it sounds like we escaped the worst of the U.S. tariffs. But I'd like to turn to you, Catherine, and then Marco. What's your sense of the state of the nation here?
I think you're right. We did miss the worst. What he basically said was that most of the USMCA, the trade agreement, Mexico, Canada, US, was going to hold. In other words, he would respect that. The tariffs are still on aluminum and steel, which is a big deal for Canada. But it's also a big deal for the US because actually they import a lot of our aluminum, in particular, steel as well. So that'll be interesting. And the whole auto thing is really up in the air. An awful lot of analysts are saying, okay, he's exempted a lot of the auto sector, but he's talking about if it contains a certain proportion of parts that were made in the US and so on. The auto sector in Canada and the US is so, and Mexico as well for that matter, but is so integrated. How that's going to work is baffling everybody. Nobody knows how can you say, okay, this car has 33.2% parts from the US or whatever. It's going to be very interesting to see how that's implemented. But I think overall it'll be interesting to see how this all shakes out. Some bad actors on the international trade scene, like China, richly deserve to have tariffs levied against them. Other players, not so much. So you can't. It's hard to generalize. And the U.S. for the longest time, for decades, has been the dominant player in the world economy and the security around the world, and so on. And Trump is moving away from that. And I tend to think that's bad for the world, to be perfectly honest with you. U.S. leadership has, on balance, been positive. Nothing's perfect, but I think it's been positive over the years for world peace and world economic prosperity as well. So how this will all shake out, and of course, Trump changes his mind frequently. So we're not sure exactly how long this tariff regime is going to stay in place. And for a lot of businesses, like in my organization, I've spoken to a lot of our businesses that are affected one way or the other by this. They say that the tariffs are one thing, but how long they last is a big deal too. Somebody might be able to withstand a few weeks or whatever of these kinds of tariffs, but if it lasts for 6 months, that's a whole different ballgame. So there's still a lot of uncertainty here. But yeah, I think the conclusion, we did escape the worst of it, is true.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. So we've escaped the worst, but the devil's in the details. So we have to kind of examine this further, but it is complex. So, Marco, do you have a response?
My sense of this, I'm not all that surprised, to tell you the truth, because I think we have to put this in sort of the larger picture of what Trump is trying to accomplish. And one of the main objectives here is to create Fortress North America. And that in juxtaposition to the rest of the world in terms of security and trade and many other issues. And so the targeting of Mexico and Canada was particularly strategic at the beginning, A, because negotiations are coming up to sort of redraft NAFTA, or whatever we want to call it these days. But what is also part of the strategy is to send a signal to the rest of the world that if Trump and the United States are essentially willing and able to treat their closest partners, Mexico and Canada, in the same way, imagine what they will do to you, kind of thing. And that is sort of typical Trump, right? To throw his opponents and his counterparts off balance. Catherine mentioned that he changes his mind constantly. Part of that is that same strategy, that he's trying to sort of throw people out of balance, his counterparts in negotiations. And so I see it as the conflict, if you will, between Canada and the United States and Canada and Mexico in these trade negotiations has kind of served this purpose. It has sent a signal to the rest of the world that he is going to be tough about this. And so now he is able to dial it down somewhat in this sort of North American perimeter and treat the rest of the world in a different way.
Okay, very good. So there's a lot of parts involved in this kind of discussion. I guess one of the things I'd like to just get your take on it, Marco, is why is this type of action being undertaken? We know that in domestic US politics, the Trump administration, the larger Republican ticket, really ran on a message of rebuilding America, rebuilding the middle class, repatriating jobs back to the United States, in the sense that somehow, from their perspective, because it's important we understand their perspective so we can then serve our interests well, is the whole notion that, well, the United States, to put it bluntly, has been ripped off by other nations, both friend and foe, and that this is a way to do kind of a larger reset. So the critique of Canada has been, well, you're not really watching your P's and Q's on security as you allow money laundering and fentanyl production, although fentanyl in Canada is certainly not on the same scale, surely, as a nation like Mexico. But there's still security issues. But secondly, that we're NATO laggards, which is obviously true. I don't think I'm insulting anybody recognizing that fact. And then there's the whole debate around, well, what is fair trade? And Catherine, you astutely pointed out that the nature of many of our industries, particularly automotive, is incredibly integrated. It's like parts fly back and forth over the border several times before they get into a finished product. And maybe the Trump administration, to put it kindly, isn't fully aware of that. But what I do know is that we have the opportunity to pursue a relationship here. So what is your take, Marco, on why the Trump administration is pursuing this kind of policy? Is there a short answer to that?
Yeah, I mean it's part of what I alluded in the previous response, but there's more to it. The domestic aspect of it is that Trump is trying to reset not just the economic agenda, the political agenda, the trade agenda, and particularly the security agenda. Again, going back to this sort of
Hmm.
fortress North America, and Trump is not a subtle man. And so he wants to be able to put America in a solid footing, on an equal footing, and at the same time on a superior footing than everyone else. And here's the issue. He perceives that there are imbalances in trade that he's trying to right. And
Hmm.
so he's a protectionist in some respects, but he's also he also believes in foreign trade. He wouldn't be doing this at all if he didn't believe in foreign trade and international trade. So it's a mixed balance. But on the issue of security and on the issue of sort of bringing things into balance, Canada is a good example of a country that has essentially neglected its internal and international security. We not only have spent less and less in terms of forming, training, and acquiring better equipment for our armed forces, but in some respects, and of course, the abilities of the Canadian forces has also shrunk, both in size and abilities to respond, et cetera, et cetera. But the premise of this for Canadians has always been that, well, we don't need to spend much money on these issues because the Americans are going to protect us. And so
Hmm.
we've been an awful friend and kind of a terrible neighbor because we are counting on them to continue to spend to defend us. And they don't want to be taken for granted anymore. Trump has kind of seized on this, and he wants to make sure that Canada pulls its own weight and pays its own way in terms of international commitments and in terms of securing or helping to secure North America. Of course, added to that is the issue, as you pointed out, of the porosity of the border, in which there is all kinds of things moving back and forth in the border. We can complain that there are weapons and certain things coming in the other way, which is true, but there is also a whole lot of drugs. Yes, we can try to make equivalences and say that it's not as bad as Mexico, but it doesn't really matter. The fact is there's a significant amount of drugs moving from Canada into the United States, or other bad actors using Canada as a departing point to pour drugs into the United States. And there is also the issue, of course, of some bad actors, including known terrorists or people that have
Hmm.
terrorist intentions, who come to Canada and cross the borders. So Trump may be a blunt guy, maybe an undesirable neighbor in some respects. He's not a nice man in many ways. But that's got nothing to do with the fact that, in some respects, what he is trying to bring to a balance, I would say, looking at it from a detached point of view, he is probably right.
Okay, very interesting analysis. So, Catherine, turning to you, what's your sense of what's driving these kinds of actions from the United States? Is it really fulfilling domestic promises that were made in the election?
Well, I think it was for Trump. He has said for some time, and even in his first term, he came across as a protectionist in a number of regards. So this isn't new. This is something he's done before. And from, I mean, my background's economics, and from an economic standpoint, when he homed in on our the fact that the U.S. happens to have a trade deficit with Canada, it's not that simplistic. The reason, and Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta, brought this out very clearly. She said if you take energy out of the equation, the U.S. actually has a surplus with Canada.
Good point. Yeah.
Energy is the main, because we export a ton of energy, and Trump might like to
Indeed.
say we're self-sufficient, we can do everything for ourselves, but
Mhm.
Canada
No.
exports the type of heavy oil that the refineries in the US are set up to receive. So the notion that they can just overnight do a switcheroo and somehow replace that Canadian product is just not so. But the notion of having trade relationships go into surplus, into deficit, that's what they do. And we also sell our energy, and this is because we have landlocked supply in many regards. We haven't been able to build the pipelines and the infrastructure that we need to export other than to the US. So we sell our energy to them at a discount. They actually benefit from that. So, the
Indeed.
simplistic thing that, there's a deficit, therefore we're being taken advantage of is not the case. So, the facts do not bear that out. That being said, it sounds good, I guess, if you just, from an American standpoint, oh yeah, well, let's get these guys that are taking advantage of us. It probably sounds like a good plan. So he's based his premises on some fairly simple, statements and assumptions. But the interesting thing is too, right now, an awful lot of Republicans are having problems with what he's doing with these trade issues, tariffs, and so on. We had that bill passed in the Senate just this week, where a lot of Republicans actually supported it, where it was geared to, I don't want to get into too much inside baseball here, but it was geared to counter Trump's efforts to put on these kinds of trade measures. So, and from the perspective, and Marco was alluding to this, a lot of these issues, certainly security issues, Canada has dropped the ball itself. Trump or no Trump, we should have a secure border. Trump or no Trump, we should have immigration under control, and we do not. We should be participating more in our defense, and we've been doing that for a number of governments. So you can't blame any one particular government for that. That's been happening for quite a long time now. And yeah, we do depend on the US, because we know if Canada was under threat, they would have a pretty serious interest in making sure that we were protected as well. So I mean, people like to point the finger at Trump, and he is very much a flamboyant kind of figure that attracts attention. But I also blame our own government for letting things get so out of control that we are not better situated. We're vulnerable. We're vulnerable because our border is weak and porous, and because, and again, Marco said, the drug issue is definitely happening in Canada. We read about how the Chinese triads and the Mexican cartels are partnering up now. Isn't that pleasant? Partnering up now to join together and have more drug problems going across the border than there were previously. So I'd like to see Canada focus on what we can control. We can't control Trump. He's not. We can't elect him. We can't get rid of him. We've got to deal with him for the next few years. Why don't we concentrate on strengthening our own economy? The things we have control over, our tax policy, our regulatory policy, building up our economy so we're much more resilient to threats from Trump or anybody else.
Okay, so that sounds like a great insight, is that, we're often told as adults that the only thing that we can control is our own reaction. So in this case, in the frame of a nation, it begs the question, how do we work well to strengthen our own nation by pursuing good public policy that, puts us in a stronger position? And right now it strikes us as that Canada is in a weak position. I want to bring up a chart actually just to frame this up. If we look at the economic growth that's been experienced the last several years in this country, and it's pretty stunning. Canada is that little red dot up at the top of the chart, growth based on GDP per capita in the last 10 years. We have a whole list of countries from Germany to Japan. We have the Netherlands at some 14.1%, Denmark at 18.9%, and of course the United States at 20.7%. So, in some ways, this kind of talk about tariffs kind of comes at the worst possible time, because our country's kind of in a weak position. Is that a fair comment, Marco and Catherine?
Absolutely. Look, that chart says the story quite succinctly, right? The United States has had or experienced growth over this period of time that is 40 times that of Canada. 40 times. And that's
Remarkable.
outrageous. That's remarkable, but it's also outrageous. It
Mhm.
is outrageous that our productivity is down. Our ability to control our own economic future is essentially vanishing right before our eyes, and that in those conditions, our leaders choose to pick a fight or push a fight with the strongest economy on the planet is rather unthinkable. I have used the comparison before of the Iranian mullahs in 1979 when they came in and they kicked the Shah out, and one of the first things that they did was they massacred all their generals. And then soon thereafter, they picked a fight with Iraq. And so they weakened their military and then they went to war with their neighbors. We have enormously weakened our economy and now are wanting to spoil for a fight with the largest economy on the planet. Is kind of silly.
Mhm. Well,
Great
quite an
analogy.
analogy.
Great
You know,
analogy, Marco.
I think we'd all agree that Canada, in principle, has everything going for it. We've got the resources. We have, in many respects, great people. We have enormous geography going for us. Like we have all these strategic advantages. We should be, in principle, the strongest, most prosperous, freest nation in the world. And so, Catherine, I turn to you and say, like this kind of chart, how do you connect the dots to both policy and you're the president of the coalition of concerned manufacturers and businesses? Why is this story unfolded? What's the answer to that?
Bad policy, bad government policy. I mean, policy matters. I think we often think, one government is the same as the other government, and so on. But that's not the case. We have had a decade, and people are calling it Canada's lost decade for a reason, where
Mhm.
we've grown government like mad. And any economy that grows government at the expense of the private sector, when you look at our job creation numbers, for example,
Mhm.
we've seen the public sector grow like crazy, and the private sector, which of course supports government. So you've got the tax consuming part of the economy exceeding the growth in the tax produce the productive part of the economy. That's not sustainable, and it weakens the productive private sector by having such government growth over
Mhm.
taxation and over regulation as well. You mentioned resources. I think the resource sector in Canada is the largest single sector that contributes to our gross domestic product, our economy.
Mhm.
And the fact that it has been hamstrung, it's been hobbled. We haven't built the infrastructure we need. We've had countries coming to us begging for our natural gas, and we've said no. There's no business case for that. And of course, there is a business case. We've seen other countries seem to have no problem making a business case. It is self-inflicted. It's basically self-inflicted. And I think that chart you showed, it's important. You hear GDP per capita. What does that mean? Well, what that means is standard of living. That means our standard of
Yes.
living as Canadians. And the fact that it really hasn't budged in the time period, the decade that it covers there, and yet it's raced ahead in other countries. I mean, a lot of governments like to say, "Oh, we have global factors we can do nothing about," and that's true. That's true at times. But when we look at the performance of other countries, and notably the U.S., because they are our biggest trading partner, obviously.
Mhm.
But when we look at that compared to us, and the fact that they outpace us by a factor of 40, that's inexcusable. And that is a self-inflicted wound. And it's a serious one for Canada because you're not going to reverse that quickly. We've seen investment flee Canada because you can't get anything done.
Mhm.
You see
Mhm.
businesses, I know with our organization, we have a board of that are basically largely manufacturers, not exclusively. And 10 years ago, none of them had a US facility. Now about half of them do, and the rest are seriously looking at it. What does that tell you in terms of the competitiveness of the Canadian economy? And these are good jobs. These are good jobs
Wow.
that are leaving Canada.
So just to clarify, so within your, we'll call it a sample group, the members of your organization, you had a number of years ago, none of them had US facilities, but now half of them do.
That's our
And
board. Yeah, that's our board. And this wasn't
okay.
something they wanted to do. This was
Yeah.
something they were forced to do to continue to have viable businesses and to offer jobs.
Wow.
Nobody willingly, it's complicated to open a new facility in another
Okay,
country.
but let's just put this into perspective. That chart then is not just a concept. It actually relates to the quality of life that Canadians have, because if you don't have growth, you don't have jobs, and if you don't have jobs, you don't really have a quality of life. You don't have, well, those schools, hospitals, let alone money in your pocket to be able to live out the Canadian dream, quite frankly. I mean, I'm simplifying it, but it is that simple, is it not, Catherine?
Yeah, well, it is. It can be simplified down to that. Like I say, GDP per capita is a great proxy for standard of living. So there's our standard of living basically lagging while other countries have been moving ahead, outpacing us by a lot.
Mhm.
And yeah, it's very disheartening. We're very overtaxed in this country, very overtaxed compared to other countries. So there you've got government growth in government, excessive growth in government at the expense of the private sector, and that means people could have, we see all the signs. We see homelessness problems that are worse than ever. We see food bank lines again, record problems with that. We see our immigration system is backlogged to the nth degree, and we see all the tangible evidence of the bad government policies that have been happening. And because of Canada's, you mentioned it earlier, David, we have immense wealth in this country that we are squandering, and that is the real shame.
Okay, so I'm going to turn to Marco in a moment for your comment, but I noticed the audience, and we really appreciate that, is making a lot of interesting comments and also questions. Ross McD says, with respect to the GDP figures, did the massive increase in the federal government's population under Liberal government policy positively or negatively affect us? That's a great question, Ross, and thank you. Marco, do you want to take a stab at that question?
Yeah, the quick answer to that, and Catherine sort of alluded to it earlier, the size of the federal government in the last 10 years has grown over 42%. So nearly, so that means in real terms, it means that the amount of money that we spend running the federal government has also grown dramatically. And
Mhm.
sometimes might even be, of course, not just because of it, but because there is also a great deal of other spending that they do, but just on the personnel alone. And that means that 40% of people are part of what normally economists call the non-productive part of the economy.
Mhm.
These are people who are earning a living off the earnings of the rest of the population. So
Mhm.
that's a weight on the shoulders of people who have to work hard for their own money. And in order to do that, of course, we have to keep increasing taxes. As Catherine rightly points out, we have been taxing Canadians nearly to death. And so the more that happens, the more there is a burden on the economy. There is less energy in the actual economy and in the productive forces of the country. So that's not a surprise. There is a very strong connection there.
I
Okay,
think
so
too,
good answer.
if I can add that from a macroeconomic perspective too, government spending more and more and more is inflationary. And we've seen horrible problems with inflation in our economy. And part of the things like food bank lines are a function of the fact that food prices have gone through the roof in recent years. So these are things that could have been avoided by the right approach by government, and they have not been.
Yeah, inflation
Okay,
is
so
an indirect tax. Yeah.
Exactly.
exactly.
And
Yeah, and
sneaky
to be
too.
clear,
Sneaky tax.
inflation, yeah, it does affect everybody as you go to the grocery store. And inflation, as I remind people again and again, is not a product of the producer or the consumer. It's a product of too much government spending too much money, period. Now, it's interesting. I've got some other comments, and I apologize. I don't quite know how to pronounce the person's call name there. We send natural gas into the US at a pittance. They then liquefy it and send it to the EU at three times what we get if we did the same thing. So I think that's a very good point. It's a very interesting point that we could dive into a little bit. And I think it's something that you alluded to actually, Catherine, is that we sell oil and gas from this country, Canada, because we only send it primarily to the United States. We sell it at a discount. We don't get full world market price because we only have this primary customer. And so we basically rip ourselves off. I mean, this is the irony because of silly, that's the polite word to say, silly Canadian policy and this war on Canadian oil and gas. We're ripping Canadians off in the amount of hundreds of billions of dollars. So I think this is really one of the major stories. I mean, I think this is what's so profoundly bizarre about some of this concern. And I share this concern about US tariff wars and all the rest. But again, I think both of you have used the word self-inflicted pain on Canadians because we have, frankly, elected officials that are pursuing policies that don't serve Canadians well. This seems to be the theme, is it not, Catherine?
Yeah, no, absolutely it is. Of course, we also always face stuff globally that, again, we can't control. But I've said for decades to governments, look at the things you can control. And of course, governments like to find a scapegoat. Hey, it's not me, it's that other guy over there that's doing it to us. And yeah, global forces are a factor. But no, most of what Canada has expanded, that chart, David, shows it in spades, doesn't it? If it was global forces, everybody would be suffering. But obviously, we've done a lot of we've made a lot of self-inflicted wounds, and we need to reverse that. And if I had to guess, given that the resource sector is the single largest sector in Canada, we got lots of it. We're blessed with our resources. We have not been taking advantage of it. And what kills me is a lot of it is justified by climate, right? Climate, because we have to obey all these climate, constraints. We can't exploit this. And yet, look at our liquid natural gas. If we exported that to Asia, where Asia uses a lot of coal, coal's a lot dirtier for the environment than liquid natural gas is. So it would even be an environmental boon if we got our act together and exported more of that. And of course, from our economy would benefit enormously. So absolutely, I think if I ever had to pick one thing that Canada should do, and there's a long list of things Canada should do, but if I had to pick one, it would be unleash our resource wealth responsibly. And that's the other factor. And I know people have probably heard this a million times, but we import oil from countries that have environmental standards that are way lower than ours. Tell me, even if you're a real climate crusader, tell me how that makes sense.
Yeah. How does that make sense? So you're talking about countries like Venezuela, among
Saudi
others,
Arabia.
Saudi Arabia that we're importing oil from. That doesn't make sense, does it, Marco?
Not to mention, by the way, their record also on human rights, right? The greatest improvement in human rights in Saudi Arabia in the last decade has been that women can now drive in Saudi Arabia. But woohoo! But the reality is that we should not be importing oil from anywhere else, or energy for that matter. We have energy coming out of our ears. There is the price differential in Europe, for example. Gas is worth 4 times what it's worth in Alberta. Imagine if we were able to.
Pardon me. Can you repeat that again?
Natural gas. The price of natural gas in Europe is 4 times what we pay for the same amount of gas in Alberta. 8 times in Ukraine, because they're in a war and they would love to have some of our gas. And of course, on the price difference, and that's just on natural gas. On oil, we pay. We essentially sell to the United States our oil at a discount of about $20 to $25 on the average per barrel. If you do the math, we sell about 2 million barrels of oil a day to the United States. It's in the billions each year, of course. And all those billions of dollars are dollars that we are exporting essentially to the United States, to the middlemen who are buying oil from us and selling it in the open markets at a higher price. So Danielle Smith is right. We are subsidizing the American economy in these respects. But what gets me mad is, where are these people who claim to be fighting on the side of Canadian sovereignty? Where are these people's elbows? Uh, talking about Canadian energy and the price of gas and oil
Mhm.
that we're selling at a discount. So all these slogans mean absolutely nothing. The reality is, they have not been doing their job defending Canadian sovereignty, the Canadian economy, and Canadian resources.
Yeah, no, it's very well said, Marco. Where have these people been? And let's get it together here, folks. So there's a lot of questions from the audience here. I do want to remind everyone I'm having a conversation today with Dr. Marco Navarro-Genie, Vice President of Research and Policy at Frontier, as well as Catherine Swift, the President of the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses. So we're talking about the world today, policy as it relates to not only the fast-moving pace of U.S. tariffs and the world, but also in the context of today's election. So we're very grateful for your comments. Make sure you make sure you share these kinds of conversations. We need to spread the word and elevate the level of thinking around public policy in this country. I think we'd all agree with that. It's interesting. I have a comment from Kenzie Kraken. Carney has been forcing companies to adopt the quote, a green agenda, for they will not get banking services. So that's an interesting comment. He's very responsible for this financial mess. Carney will further ruin Canada with obviously those kinds of policies. So, is that what do you think of that comment, Catherine? I mean, it's interesting. I know that our Prime Minister has played a very important role pursuing net zero policies. I think he's actually still standing by the policy of no pipelines in Canada, the so-called Bill C-69. What's your response to that kind of comment made by our audience?
Well, the commenter is 100% correct. What Mark Carney's been doing on the international stage for about the last decade with the WEF, the World Economic Forum, with the UN as the special climate envoy, and with global, what a crummy acronym, eh? Global fight, what is it? Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero.
For
That's
net
it.
zero, yeah.
Audit is very much imposing. And if you read his book, there's some scary stuff in there. He says things like, well, businesses that don't adhere to these rules that we the tall foreheads are serving up to everybody else, they're going to be called climate roadkill, because businesses that don't conform to these rules, and I've been following closely, I tell you, if you've got insomnia problems,
Sorry,
I can recommend some reading for you. But
sorry,
all
Catherine,
these complex rules.
You said these businesses will become climate, pardon me?
Roadkill.
Roadkill. Oh.
This was Carney's expression, because they will be denied financing and insurance. This is why, he's been focusing on the whole financial sector to cut off businesses that do not adhere to these immensely complex, rigid, and red tape laden rules that these international organizations are devising right now. And from someone that represents a lot of small and medium-sized businesses, these are deadly. We probably don't even have enough time to get into the complexity of it. It's unbelievable. But the red tape that if this is implemented, and by the way, Canada is talking about implementing them, it's things like you have to report, if you have say you're a small grocer, just to give an example, and you have a certain product on your shelf, you have to somehow report the greenhouse gases that the creation of that product emitted in its creation. So, it's downstream emissions. So its final use in the hands of a consumer or a business, say, what will the emissions be there? Can you imagine how much speculation and absurdity that those kinds of having to report those kinds of issues can entail? And the whole this is an accounting standard. They're looking at making this an accounting standard. So all of the accounting organizations are very embroiled in this whole thing, which I feel is disgraceful, to be honest, because they should be standing up for their customers, the businesses, including small and medium-sized businesses, that will never be able to comply with this, and they will become roadkill as a result. Do we really want as a country to lose our whole small and medium-sized business sector? I don't think so. That's a very dynamic and important part of the economy.
But this is a very important policy issue that I think, Catherine, you've outlined, is that on so many fronts, the policies are integrated through almost like third parties that kind of surround businesses, like the
unelected ones too. Unelected ones, David.
Unelected ones that are not, accountable to the people. So it's the big, how do you say, workaround, where you basically use public policy through these third-party levers, not through the democratic process. And that's why you have these, net zero policies, as well as it's called ESG, environmental social governance, where you rate companies on kind of a fancy scorecard or index. And you say, well, if you meet our values and what we value, then you can get the money. And if you don't, then you don't get the money. And I think that's where you're saying, wow, if you don't bow down to that kind of policy prescription, then you will be roadkill. You will be put out of business, and those people will be out of work, and there goes your standard of living. So is that a fair summary of also what's going on here when it comes to policy choices, Marco?
Yeah, and it betrays a certain kind of thuggery if you really think about it, right? Because
thuggery is the
yes,
word.
you're threatening people's businesses, and you're threatening them from the top down, right? So Mr. Carney was one of the principal builders of this global alliance that is now threatening small businesses in this way, and it's right in his book, as Catherine points out. Now, the interesting thing, though, is that alliance seems to be now falling apart. The wheels seem to be coming off of it recently. Just in the last few months, some of the major members of that alliance have announced that they're pulling out. And so we could potentially see the unraveling of that whole scheme in the near future. The irony, of course, is that if that happens, it essentially signifies that the world is turning away from that kind of nonsense, while in Canada, the party in power seems to be sort of pushing that kind of approach, and it'll be interesting to see if actually we get to form a government that pushes those kinds of ideas. It would essentially put Canada at odds with some of the major financial hubs in the world that are moving in the opposite direction.
No, well
Absolutely
said.
true.
We've got a lot of great comments here. Kenzie Kraken says he has destroyed the UK economy almost single-handedly. He openly said that companies will not receive financial services unless they comply. Exactly. So this is very interesting. Catherine, you had another comment?
Well, I was just going to say the whole climate thing, which is enormous and which took off for a while there. But as Marco said, people are peeling off because it's interesting when you first hear something, everybody wants to do the right thing for the environment. I think everybody, decent
Indeed.
people, I sure do. But people are realizing that they were sold a lie. They were realizing they were sold a bill of goods when they were told, if we don't, back in the 90s, we can say, oh, if we don't do something in 10 years, those islands are going to be submerged. They're not submerged. Our polar bears our polar bears are fine. We have seen with experience with these radical, and they are radical policies, we've seen that they're not true. They're lies. And I think this is why the GFANSs, the silly acronym I mentioned earlier, and these alliances of big banks, big insurance companies, big investors that Carney got together to promote this agenda, they're peeling off now because they're realizing these are devastatingly negative policies for average people, for average businesses, and for the economy in general. So these guys, they basically told us lies to get us to buy into this agenda. And now people are seeing the truth and backing away. So, but the risk of Canada continuing to adhere from it, because we've got some true believers who are setting policy in this country,
Mhm.
and us
Mhm.
being therefore outliers for the rest of the world and hurting ourselves, while others are not imposing those kind of negative policies on their people. That's the big risk now. And that's what we should all, as Canadians, be quite concerned about.
Okay,
Yeah,
so you're really challenging that narrative.
imagine essentially the perpetuation of that graph that you just keep
Sure.
showing, right? That's what it means. And look, half a percentage growth or less than half a percentage growth is basically a kind of death. Because
Mm.
in economic terms, if you're not growing, you are dying. But that's not
Mhm.
just a slogan. If you look at that graph and you look at all those countries getting ahead and we're standing still pretty close to zero, what that
Mhm.
means is that the world is moving on and we're standing still. That is a certain and sure kind of economic death.
Okay, so in that context, and that's a very compelling point, Marco, is that shows stagnation. So the question is, if that continues, that kind of trajectory because of these kinds of policies, that explains why, to put it in practical terms, let's use a family in Ontario has an income that's about 25, $30,000 less than the poorest state in the union, Mississippi. That explains that, but we're just not aware of that because we don't go to Mississippi much, do we?
No, but some of us, the vast majority of us live within a couple of 100 kilometers of the U.S. border. And we have experiential knowledge of the divide, and one could argue even greater, right? So, there are so many, for example, Canadians that live in within a stone throw proximity of Michigan and New York State, for example, some of the richer places in the Union. I live in Alberta. I'm not very far away from Montana and Idaho,
Mhm.
and British Columbians are close to Washington. So we have a certain kind of experiential knowledge that we are being left behind. People have to cross the border to go shopping, and it's a lot harder now that the Canadian dollar is not worth much anyway. So we don't even have to compare ourselves to Mississippi, that is so far away from us. The reality is that the adjacent states even present an even starker contrast to where we are.
I think you're right. When I look at this issue, what is also fascinating is this whole income differential. And I just want to get back to the whole issue of tariffs here because I think it'll be interesting to see how this plays out in terms of further impacts on this country and how the U.S. policy continues. But what does strike me is that Canada has pursued so many policies that have not really served Canadians well, and that's why we're in this vulnerable position. So, um, one of the things that fascinates me is the response by the Prime Minister to this concern about tariffs. And I want to give, in all fairness to the Prime Minister, there's this initial statement that he made just a few days ago about the US relationship, because this is our most important trading partner. And I want to share that clip now.
We will need to ensure that Canada can succeed in a drastically different world. The old relationship we had with the United States, based on deepening integration of our economies and tight security and military cooperations, is over.
So, this clip I find a bit confusing because he says the relationship is over when in fact shouldn't this be an opportunity to work better with the United States? I mean, we've got to know what the Canadian interests are and pursue smart public policy to serve Canadians. But he's really laying down a first principle that the relationship is over. Why would we talk like that, Catherine?
I found it a very irresponsible statement, to be honest with you. I would love to see if we could have an imaginary world where we weren't in the middle of an election campaign right now. I'd like to see what he'd be saying. I don't think it would be that. Let's face it, a combative relationship with the US, notably with Trump, because Trump is one of those polarizing figures. And we know that a lot of Canadians don't like him. So that kind of statement is playing well from a partisan political standpoint, from an electoral standpoint. And a lot of Canadians, the booing of the national anthems and saying Elon Musk shouldn't have Canadian citizenship. I mean, this kind of stuff I find a little juvenile, to be perfectly honest with you. It's kind of let's kick sand in the face of the bully and then run away fast. When you look historically, though, from an economic standpoint, we have had a very solid and on balanced, very positive relationship with the US. Who would you
Yes.
rather have as a neighbor? Would you rather have China? Would you rather have Russia? I mean, come on. We have benefited immensely as a country because of our proximity to the US. And by the way, we've had fights with them before. This isn't the first one. And a lot of people, it's sort of old history. But what happens is you have a disruption. Everybody gets mad for a while, and then you reconcile, and things settle down again. Trump's only around for a few years. I know he's talking about a third term, but I don't think that'll ever happen. But he's around. He's a short-term phenomena in our long, long history. So to say our relationship's over is ludicrous to my way of thinking. And I heard somebody say once, can't remember who it was, but you can't take a chainsaw to the 49th parallel. We are joined at the hip. We've benefited from that way more than we've suffered. So let's take a longer term perspective here, Canadians, and realize we've actually benefited a lot from our relationship with the U.S. We'll continue to. We're having an eruption right now of problems, and we have to take them seriously. But I guess I get back to my earlier point. Why not take control of the stuff we have control over? Strengthen our economy for the long term so that we can not only withstand this particular, relatively short-term eruption, but be in good condition for our long-term economic success.
Okay, so let's keep level heads. What do you say, Marco?
Absolutely. I'd like to pick up on Catherine's point about the irresponsibility of the statement, and her point that this is essentially a play inside what is the dynamics of a national election, a federal election. I will say something else in relation to that statement, is that we must not forget, we must remember that the day after he said that, he was on the phone talking to Trump.
Good point.
And saying that everything was fine, that the president and he had their own differences, but they were still so. One day versus the other, two completely different and conflictive statements. I will point out as well that at the beginning of the campaign, he was talking about developing the energy potential of Canada, building pipelines. He said the P word, and now he's backtracking on that and saying that there's no way that there's going to be a Canada East pipeline and so forth. So what that tells me, and I've seen this play out many times as a political scientist in sort of election strategies, is that there is a strategy here of sowing chaos in sort of the electoral attention span of Canadians. The idea here is to create uncertainty, and the creation of uncertainty ramps up anxiety, and that anxiety translates into fear. Fear is the name of the game in this election. So fear of what? Well, there is a boogeyman, and it's the orange guy, right? Trump is the bad guy. I will point out that this strategy worked very well for the same political party back at the last election, except that back then the boogeyman was a virus and a variety a great variety of variants, they called it. So, because it wasn't enough to have just one virus, but there had to be all these hundreds of variants, which also received names, and they were given all kinds of spooky names. So the idea
Okay.
here is this is not new, right? It's not new even in the history of humanity that governments present themselves as necessary and as the defenders of a particular society or a particular state in the face of a real, sometimes real, but in this case, imaginary boogeyman or an imaginary enemy. The Americans are not our enemies, as Catherine points out. At best, sometimes they are competitors in an arena of economics and what have you, but they are our allies. And they're not just any allies, they are our single greatest allies because we're not going away, right? Poland isn't detaching from Russia geographically any more than Canada is detaching itself from the United States. So this is essentially an electoral play. Canadians should be awake to it. What makes it worse, though, is that it's not just Carney. The conservatives are kind of playing on the same boogeyman, and that leaves us as a citizenry in a place where there is very little choice in effect in this election. We're back again at the conditions that we were in COVID. You might remember that in COVID there was no opposition to the whole COVID scare, and we are now in the same place that there is no
Interesting.
opposition to the Donald Trump boogeyman scare.
Okay, so you're speaking. I'm sure the audience perhaps senses this, but you're a political scientist, and so you look at not only as we were discussing today the policy choices, but also you're looking at the larger picture of the dynamics of an election, saying, "Hey, wait a sec here. You've got to understand that tactically, and politicians are known to play a political game here to try to get to power. The use of emotion is very important here. And this one seems to be fear. I think that's what you're getting at here. There's a larger fear play. And in fact, you're challenging us then, Marco, to think about policy and with our minds, dare I say, instead of just being led by the nose by, well, the use of emotion and fear.
Yes, we have to look at policy, and we also have to look at the last 10 years. Right? Because that's the distraction here, right? We want people to be scared of the orange guy at the expense of looking at the record of the last 10 years. And that graph, again, we keep coming back to that graph, but that graph is an expression of the policies of the last 10 years.
Right
So
on.
we need to be consciously aware and consciously examining the policies that have led us here.
Okay, so I want to shift a little bit in our conversation here, but I want to do so with a bit of a quick question to you, Catherine. So, if we look at the Prime Minister's statement saying that the relationship is over, and we'll see what the response is from the Government of Canada now to the announcement of tariffs. So, we'll wait and see what those specifics are. But the point is, we shouldn't just give up on the US market, right? We shouldn't just
Well,
give
we,
up
we
on the
can't.
relationship. That would be insane, wouldn't it? We can't. Can we?
We can't. First of all, we're highly integrated with them, and part of it is geography, no question. But a lot of it is we speak the same language, more or less, and we have similar cultures. They're not identical, but we're reasonably similar. I think we have similar values as societies. We believe in freedom. We believe in free markets, more or less, and democracy and all that good stuff. So there, even if we weren't geographic, stuck to the hip type of thing, we would still, I would think, want a positive relationship with the U.S. Also, as the biggest economy in the world, it benefits us hugely because we can leverage. We wouldn't have the economy we have without the
Yeah,
U.S. as our neighbor.
absolutely.
Period. So this is why I found that statement of Carney's really irresponsible. It implied we could do without them, and it's absurd to think we could. And he's talking about Europe. He's talking about being closer to Europe. Well, I mean, I think we should seek out other markets. Don't get me wrong. It's always great to diversify your exports and imports and so on. But the notion that it's just not on that Europe We do more trade with one state in the US than we do with France. It's just, but so it's not to say we shouldn't. Of course, we should look for new markets. We always should be on the lookout. But to pretend, and by the way, to be part of the EU, the so-called sclerotic economies of the EU, which are buried in overregulation. They've adopted these green policies, and we haven't mentioned this issue yet. But it's not simply economics, of course, or security or whatever. But look at the geopolitical situation. When Germany found Russia was squeezing it on natural gas, and they were worried literally about freezing to death in the dark because they were importing so much of their fuel source from Russia. How is that good for the stability of the world? Canada should be supplying those markets. Reliable, environmentally sensible Canada should be supplying those markets, not dependent on a rogue state like Russia.
No, I agree.
And the fact that we are also sending the Europeans are essentially feeding the war machine by buying all this energy from the Russians, right? So it's ludicrous to think that that they, being the Europeans who are trying to help Ukraine, are at the same time feeding the Russian military machine with the other hand.
No, it's really almost bizarre public policy here. It's interesting, a comment from Ron who said 77% of Canadians' economy is based upon trade with the United States. I think it actually is a little bit higher, but point well said, Ron. So thank you for all your comments from the audience. I'm talking with Dr. Marco Navarro-Genie, Vice President of Research at Frontier, as well as Catherine Swift, the President of the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses. Well, there's a lot going on here. It's interesting. Speaking of energy, I saw a fascinating headline yesterday, which has to do with natural gas and Pennsylvania. You may have all heard of, I believe it's called Homer City, PA. I have driven through it. It's right on the other side of, east side of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And it's a fascinating story. And it kind of goes like this. Apparently, the manufacturers of natural gas turbines have a backlog of years of business. In other words, there is a huge demand now for those turbine generators that go out 4 to 5 years to 2028, no less. And would you believe that there's a number of parties that have booked early the building of a huge natural gas facility? I believe its estimated budget so far, phase 2, is some $11 billion. That facility will take up 4.6 gigawatts. That's equivalent to powering up, certainly 2 Torontos by my estimation. And that kind of electricity is going to be generated to set up a whole series of data farms. And certainly when we look at the energy mix in Canada, this strikes me as an interesting opportunity. I would argue that Canada's got one of the best energy mixes in the world. And I would say the greenest energy mix, from natural gas and oil to hydro to nuclear. We've got a lot of great energy in Canada. And it seems to me that we should be having those locations for those huge data farms. And yet, ironically, we're looking at a massive subsidy play for EV facilities in Canada, just as the EV market is changing and shifting as the US stops their subsidy programs and Canadian governments are now following suit. So what the heck is going on here? Isn't this an example where if we had some focus on our own strengths and energy, we could be making all kinds of jobs in this country? Are we forfeiting the opportunities that are right before our noses, Catherine and Marco?
Yeah, of course we are. Again, get back to my earlier point, and of let's strengthen our own economy with things that we can control. We have 100% control over developing stuff like that. I believe Danielle Smith and Kevin O'Leary recently came to some kind of agreement on a big data farm in Alberta, if I'm not mistaken. I can't remember how many billions of dollars, but it was real money. And good on them, because this is AI. This is AI. these data, the whole notion of these data farms is to power the world of AI, which is coming at us really, really fast. So yeah, we don't want to give up that opportunity because of course we have we have all these riches that and they're not bad for the climate. They're positive, and yet we're hobbling them. We're keeping them down for misguided reasons that have nothing, that are not bolstered by fact, that are, that it's so foolhardy to hobble ourselves like that and to punish Canadians. It punishes average Canadians. We should have higher incomes. We should have a better standard of living, a more robust economy. So when somebody does
Right
level
on.
threats at us, we can handle it.
Right on. What do you say, Marco?
Yeah, there's a sense in which we need to look at it from a pragmatic economic point of view. There is a wide variety of energy sources in Canada, as you point out, geothermal, wind. We even have tidal energy. There's nearly just about every energy source that there is on the planet. Canada has it, and that's kind of remarkable. But governments have no business in picking and choosing which one we ought to use. The market should determine that, and that means a whole variety of different conditions. There's a reason why, for example, all these data centers make sense. And by the way, we're not building it on the border with the United States where it's warmer, but we're building it far further north into the province where it's cooler, and that means saving energy because these kinds of centers require enormous amounts of air conditioning and refrigeration to keep the servers from overheating. And so, that's a natural advantage that we have in the northern latitudes, for example, and that's good for the environment at the same time because we're spending less energy sort of cooling these places. Those are determinants that come from the market, not decisions from the government. And so, by the way, I should also point out that the vast majority of the time in which governments pick and choose from the market and make market decisions, they flop and they fail, right? So
Yes.
it's not like governments had this magical and absolutely perfect record that every time they choose or run something that they always get it right. In fact, it's the opposite. The vast majority of the time, not only do they get it wrong, but they fail. And so that's not to say, of course, that private interests in the market don't fail, but the scales are different. And so let the market do its thing. The market is not perfect either. I'm not suggesting that. But governments should have no business picking and choosing what kind of energy Canadians should use.
Also,
I
when
think
businesses make a decision, they do it with their own money. When you're spending somebody else's money, hey, the
Bingo.
sky's the limit.
Bingo. Yeah.
right on. So yeah, these are complex investment opportunities. So government doesn't have that expertise. So stay out of the market and let the market proceed, and let's save those taxpayers' monies. Now, in the meantime, let's build this incredible country with sensible public policy. On a humorous note, I was grocery shopping last night, and I just was amazed by how many Canadian flags I saw carefully through the grocery aisle. So I've always believed in trying to buy Canadian. It's not that I don't buy other things from other countries, but for the first time in my life, I actually heard the Canadian anthem in the grocery store. What isn't that something? So
Wow.
it seems to me I've never heard so much Canadian patriotism in my whole life. Are you guys making similar observations? I'm curious what our audience thinks
Yeah.
as well. So I don't know if I'm being manipulated to buy more groceries or vote in a certain way, but isn't that a funny dynamic that's going on in this country right now? Have you seen this
Well, we love to,
before,
we love to have a
Catherine?
common enemy, right? We love to have a common enemy, so we've got one right now.
I mean, it feels like we're going back to the War of 1812 or something. I'm not sure, but what do you think, Marco?
Yeah, I'm of two minds about it. I mean, I think that, loves of one country is a good thing. And Canada is a lovable country. It's my adoptive homeland. If I had stayed where I was born, I might not be alive. So I love this country. But I'm also wary of being manipulated and of fake patriotism, right? Because one has to wonder, what is it about this time in the history of this country that makes it more patriotic or more lovable than before? And the answer to that question is there isn't really. We're just being manipulated into this thing, and I kind of resent that because
Mhm.
I want to decide when I love my country and in what level of energy and intensity.
But
Okay.
it's also misdirection for political purposes, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah, it's
Always
a
easier to
manipulation.
blame the other guy than to look inside and say, wow, we created a lot of this ourselves.
We
Interesting.
so
So,
to be clear, we should love our country,
Yep,
but not because our government is telling us to.
okay. I
exactly.
like the way you guys are talking here. So, speaking of that, I do want to take a little bit as we get into the home stretch of our very interesting conversation today, and I want to thank you again for that. Is the whole issue of polling and what's going on in our country, and honestly, it's a little bit of a mystery. And I'm someone who does watch polls closely, as you know. And it has to do with, it sounds like it's not just a horse race when it comes to the two main parties. And I want to get to the NDP in a moment. But if we look at this as political scientists and as analysts, we can see that it seems like the Liberals seem to be leading in a lot of polls across the country. So I'm wondering what's going on here as it relates to the whole dynamic of what the topic is about. And of course, we know that in election campaigns, every campaign has a kind of a thesis, a theory on how the election should unfold. And it seems to me that the Liberals are kind of going in with the whole idea that if they talk about Trump as much as possible and fear, people will tend to gravitate towards them. Whereas if the election is more talking about affordability and the struggle that Canadians are having, then the Conservatives are banking that they'll talk or vote for them. And I think the NDP is struggling with where to sit here in the election. They seem to be trying to say they're for the working people, for public health care. But the NDP is at the risk of going below double digits, which is kind of surprising to me because I think that traditionally, if I look at the history of elections in this country, well, say the last 60 years, the NDP have usually had a pretty rock solid group of 10 to 15, even 20% or more of Canadians. So, what's your take on this, Marco? Do you want to go first in terms of what's happening with the electorate right now? And can we trust the polls, quite frankly?
Sure. I think on the one hand, and this is a regrettable issue, is that elections in Canada have become focused on leaders, not
Mhm.
on not on the strength of the parties that run them, not on the fiber of its policies and its ideas, but on leaders. And look, um, what 6 weeks ago, one party was basically in the doghouse, and then it changed leaders, and now we're supposed to believe that
Yeah.
they're going to win, and they might. So, but it sends a few flares up in the air about the veracity or the accuracy of the polls. I'm not casting dispersions. I'm just essentially manifesting skepticism, considering that polls have gotten it wrong several times. I'd like to remind ourselves that in the last election in November in the United States, just about every poll had Kamala Harris becoming the new president of the United States, and needless to say, that didn't happen. But the issue of leadership really is an awful distractor, because then it makes it about the quality of somebody's hair, or the color of their ties, or the funkiness of their socks, or what have you, right? And
Mhm.
that's not what as citizens we should be focusing on. But given that that is the case, the NDP, going back to your question, has pretty much shot itself in the foot,
Mm.
because the leading party has changed uh, leaders, and therefore all of a sudden we forget everything that they have done and they have been involved in, because they have a spanking shiny new leader, and the NDP still has the same guy, and it still has the same guy that, by the way, is potentially, I would argue, the weakest NDP leader since Audrey McLaughlin a generation ago, right?
Mhm.
And so he's polling very poorly, but he's also very poorly because he attached his hitch to the ruling party, and the ruling party essentially took some of their ideas, I would argue, manipulated the NDP into supporting them for the last 4 years, and now they've been discarded like essentially a used paper bag. So the voters understand that dynamic and understand that the leadership of the NDP is not viable to become the leader of this country. So I'm not surprised
Interesting.
by that.
What about you, Catherine? Your observations?
Well, I think the Liberal Party has moved so far to the left that they've eaten a lot of the NDP's lunch, so to speak, because they have moved very far to the left. When I think of that back in the day when I was working with Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin, wow, that was a whole different world.
Not your parents' liberals.
It was sensible. It was, yeah, you don't agree with everything, but I don't agree with everything any government does. So nothing new there. But that was a whole different ballgame and a whole different Liberal Party. And yes, the new leader isn't a known quantity yet. I find it interesting. I don't think there was any accident that the Liberals opted to sort of whip Carney in. Suddenly he becomes, prime minister, not elected by anybody. And then he takes an international tour. He's been kept out of the public eye more than he's been in the public eye. It's been hyper controlled. They don't let any media in that they don't know the person. Therefore, they're not taking any risks at all. And Carney, if you read his book, I know people aren't going to do that, but read his book, guys. You really get a good insight into if you think he's going to abandon what he's been doing for the last couple of decades in terms of pushing this net zero agenda and all this, climate roadkill, if you don't follow what we the elites tell you to do and so on, you're dreaming. He's devoted his career to it. So, he's not a known quantity yet. But things keep blurping out every now and again about things that aren't very popular that he's been involved with, and so on. So it's the polls are interesting because, as Marco said, of course, there's a lot of mistakes that happen in polls, and I have no doubt that some polling companies that have a very definitive political view themselves cook the polls so they don't become a reflection of what people really think. They're trying to lead people, because when you see a poll that said whoever's in the lead, when you see a poll that says so-and-so party is in the lead, if you were thinking of maybe voting for them, you go, oh, I guess that's the right thing to do, because so many people feel that way. So they end up leading people as opposed to just being a reflection, a response to what people are already thinking. So there's so many factors. Elections are such complicated times. They're exciting in their own way, but as I say to my kids, who are adults, of course, at this stage of the game, and I said, when I was their age, and this is when I was your age, it didn't matter as much which government you chose. They all had pretty comparable. Like, you wouldn't see an abrupt change in the country when you elected a liberal versus a conservative, and they're the only two parties that have ever been in government federally in this country. But now it really does matter. And look at that. Let's bring up that chart. That was IMF data in that chart you had earlier. That International Monetary Fund data is the basis of that chart. And you see there, boy, government really matters, doesn't it?
It does. It really does. It's interesting, this conversation, because I think you really are challenging us to, well, certainly look behind the polls. Are they really polls, or are they kind of pushing people to vote in a certain direction? So we can't be above that. It's interesting. There's a comment from Sunk Answer is the name. It says it's instruction, not information. And so that's probably summarizes it right there in many ways. We've got to really look with critical minds at what information is here. How are they using emotion to kind of influence people? This is truly a very important time to keep your eyes open. It is also fascinating.
David, we haven't mentioned the media yet once. And the fact that the media is being bribed with our tax dollars, if anybody thinks that doesn't have an impact, they're dreaming.
Well said. So are you suggesting that the 2,000 media outlets being funded by the federal government in this country create a conflict of interest, Catherine?
I am.
Okay. Just to be
I'm also reminded that it wasn't all that long ago, less than 2 years ago, when the president of one of the major polling companies in this country tweeted that he was going to do everything in his power to prevent the current leader of the opposition from ever getting into office. Right?
for
And
Pete's
this
sake.
is the president of a polling company in this country.
Yeah,
Yeah. So
pretty wild,
let's be
pretty
clear.
wild.
In good public policy, let alone common sense, we'd say transparency is important, let alone accountability. I mean, there's a whole series of good, principled discussion that we can have here. So if we just pick up on the thread here as we kind of get towards the end of our conversation, avoiding debates, is there going to be an English language debate, or are we going to closet the leaders so that we don't even have that opportunity to have transparent discussion about policies? I mean, the Quebec French language debate is not going to be happening. It seems to me like a great disappointment. I know there's been a lot of negative reaction in Quebec, understandably. So, like, surely this is a problem in this electoral cycle where it's almost like we're closeting the leaders and the debate that we need in this country more than ever. I thought this was a crisis. I thought this was a national crisis. And now we're proroguing the parliament and we're not even having debates. What the heck
Well,
is going on?
there is going to be a French language debate, David. In past elections, there's been the main debate, the main debate that all of the networks collaborate with. But in Quebec, there's always been this other debate, this TVA, another TV
the private
network.
chain. Yeah.
And that's the one that Carney refused to participate in. But he will be in the big main French debate, and there's going to be a main English debate. But I think that's it. I think there's just going to be the two, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because the French debate that there is going to be, it would be on the French CBC, right? Radio Canada.
Right.
TVA is the private outlet, and he's skating away from that one as far as he can. I am reminded, and historical symmetry is always fun to talk about, that the last candidate for leader to get destroyed in a debate was the successor to Pierre Trudeau. And Brian Mulroney single-handedly destroyed John Turner with the "You had a choice, sir," that single moment. And so it is not lost on me that the successor to another Trudeau may not want to be the debate roadkill on national television.
Okay, so let's stay tuned.
Lots of roadkill today.
From Kenzie saying the debates are on April 16 and 17. Thank you, Kenzie, for pointing that out. And when we talk about polls, a fascinating thing that has come up within the larger public discussion has been the whole issue of gender and even age. And I want to just summarize that quickly. You've got the claim that somehow there's the extra important role of women in this election, namely older women tending to shift towards, and there is the graph, towards the Liberal Party, which is interesting as they talk about Donald Trump, Orange Man bad. That type of rhetoric seems to be pulling women towards them. And then there's the other side of the age group there. You can see where younger women have been, I think, traditionally a very important foundational part of the NDP support, tending to be moving seamlessly towards the Liberals. Now, again, you have to take this information with a grain of salt, but do you think women are playing an extra special role in changing the dynamics of this election, Catherine? Any comment on that?
Well, I think, it seems to, you're right. There's a real generational divide for sure. And it seems to be boomer women. Well, I'm a boomer woman, so I guess I'm not typical in that respect.
You're an outlier.
What is interesting is that the boomers, and this has been pointed out quite a bit, the boomers are right now in Canada. We've actually got the richest generation of retired people in history in Canada, for all kinds of different reasons. So they're comfortable. They got a house, their mortgage is paid off. they've got a decent pension or a decent retirement plan, whatever. So they're not having a problem with the status quo. You look at the younger generations that think, I'm never going to own a house. I don't even know whether I want to, have a family right now because I don't think I can afford it. Where they're facing increasing costs without increasing incomes and so on, and they're scared, and so they want change. Whereas the older, comfy group isn't of the same thinking. Women in general, and this is not just in Canada, women in general tend to lean more left. And I don't know exactly what all the reasons for that are, but that's a given in the US, in Canada, elsewhere. So, but it just seems to be more so, especially for that older boomer woman cohort, than it has been in previous elections.
Interesting, Marco.
Yeah, I think the boomer effect is going to be interesting in this one. The people with perhaps the greatest stake are the younger people, I would argue, considering the economic situation and considering the amount of debt that we have. This is going to be essentially a massive tax on their development and their future. So. I don't think the Liberals can count on young people in the same way that they did when Prime Minister Trudeau was the candidate, and so that's a trade-off, right? Carney is an older man. He's a more sort of serious kind of figure. He looks more conservative in terms of his looks than the average picture of. Prime Minister Trudeau. So they've lost that particular aspect of the looks, or the people who make decisions by looks. But at the same time, things are in kind of flux. Young people are realizing and have realized for a long time that their economic prosperity is at stake in this election. That was essentially part of the huge boost that Pierre Poilievre had received. It's hard to imagine how that's going to play out. That is going to play out in a different way.
All right. Well, look, I'd like to thank both our panelists, Dr. Marco Navarro-Genie, as well as Catherine Swift, for joining us for this engaged conversation as we've talked both about, well, the dynamics of both public policy today, as well as even daring to dive a little bit into the nature of the polls. And I want to thank our audience for your extraordinary comments and questions. This has been a delightful conversation, so thank you very much for joining me today, Marco and Catherine.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been fun.
So please stay with us over the next week. We'll be coming back again with another panel focused largely on the policy issues regarding this election. And I also want to highlight that you can also find us on Merit TV Canada. We are found right across the coast to coast. And you can see us there on both the Bell MTS Fiber TV and also satellite and Rogers Cable from coast to coast, as we said. So please join us. And also, I wanted to highlight that on August the 19th, we've got a special event coming up at Frontier, and it's going to be Frontier on the Ocean, as we're going to have a special trip on the Grand Princess leaving the Port of Vancouver for 1 week, return to Alaska. And our guest of honor will be the Dr. Patrick Moore, who's a co-founder of Greenpeace and a senior fellow at Frontier. It will be an engaging opportunity to meet all kinds of wonderful people, and we'd love you to join us. The options are available now. We've got great pricing, so please check it out. And in the meantime, I want to wish everybody a terrific week, and thank you for joining us on this conversation today on the Frontier.
Thank you for watching Leadership